You are in a quiet, high-ceilinged room somewhere in Paris, perhaps in 1887. The hour is late, though in the drawing rooms of the Belle Epoque, time rarely holds meaning. Gaslight flickers across gilt frames and embroidered curtains, and the faint, sweet smell of ether floats through the room. A maid stands in the hallway, holding a silver tray with a small glass vial. Inside that vial is a few milliliters of pale liquid, morphine, a luxury imported from German laboratories and dispensed by the most discreet of pharmacists. This is Europe at the height of its beauty and boredom. Between the 1870s and the early 1900s, the continent was suspended in a rare kind of peace. Empires glittered, cities thrived. Fashion and architecture reached ornamental excess. And under all that beauty, beneath the silks and social grace, there pulsed a quiet dependency. Morphine had slipped from the battlefield into the boudoir, from the surgeon's table into the vanity drawers of duchesses and opera patrons. The story of morphine's rise among the aristocracy begins, rather innocently, with the promise of science. The drug had been isolated from opium in 1805 by a young German apothecary, Friedrich Renner, who named it after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. It was, at first, a scientific marvel. Physicians saw in morphine a way to relieve pain without the barbaric haze of raw opium. They spoke of it as progress, as clean chemistry that could civilize the human body. For the wounded soldiers of the Crimean War and the Franco-Prussian War, it was salvation in a syringe. But as Europe stabilized, the drug found a new clientele. The pain it treated was no longer physical. It was social, emotional, existential. The same generation that attended Wagner's operas and drank absinthe in the mirrored bars of Montmartre began to view morphine as a cure for ennui, the spiritual fatigue of comfort. In cities like Paris, Vienna, and Berlin, the morphine habit spread among women of rank. Society doctors prescribed it freely for nerves, female hysteria, and melancholy. Advertisements for morphine solutions appeared alongside those for face creams and perfumes. Even the instruments of addiction were beautiful. Elegant glass syringes with silver tips, sometimes engraved with monograms or wrapped in velvet cases. In the French capital, one might have found Madame Diem, a widowed countess of 40, sitting before her vanity table as she prepared for the evening salon. A maid would draw the curtains, the firelight would soften, and the countess would steady her hand as she filled the syringe. The first touch of morphine was not dramatic. It was quiet. It dulled the edges of loneliness. It allowed the world to slow, the conversations to shimmer, and the burden of self-awareness to fade. It was, in many ways, a medicine against too much civilization. The paradox of the Belle Epoque was that life had grown too comfortable for some. After the industrial revolutions, after the growth of cities and the expansion of leisure, the upper classes found themselves with time, and time left unfilled was often unbearable. Their ancestors had fought wars, built estates, ruled territories. They themselves were left to host soirées, to maintain appearances, to live within the decorative prisons of etiquette. Morphine, unlike alcohol, carried no odor. It was discreet. One could be perfectly proper and entirely dependent. Diaries and letters of the era, often discovered long after their writers were gone, describe a world of fainting couches and secret pouches of syringes hidden within reticules. A letter from an Englishwoman in Cannes described how the doctor gives me my little drops whenever I feel the weight of the day. She was not alone. By the 1890s, the use of morphine among European women had reached such proportions that newspapers began to refer half-jokingly to les morphinomines du salon, the salon morphine users. In Vienna, where medicine and psychology were in fashion, morphine addiction was almost a symbol of refinement. To suffer, after all, was a mark of sensitivity. Sigmund Freud himself had written on the subject of the anesthetic modern mind, though his attention had turned more toward cocaine, another fashionable drug of the era. But morphine had a subtler allure. It was private, it was ritualistic, it fit within the quiet rhythm of an aristocratic household, where servants moved silently and decorum was absolute. The medical community, for its part, was uncertain. In the 1880s, doctors began to notice that their patients required increasing doses. Morphinismus, as it was called in German medical texts, became a documented condition. Yet the prevailing belief was still that it was better than opium, less corrupting, more controlled. Some doctors even prescribed morphine as a cure for alcoholism or as a substitute for opium. The irony, of course, was that morphine's purity made it more addictive. Pharmaceutical companies flourished in this climate. In Germany, Merck began producing morphine in standardized doses, marketed to physicians as a reliable therapeutic. In Paris, The chemist Charles Romany sold morphine ampoules in beautiful etched glass, the labels printed in delicate cursive. A lady could order a dozen and have them delivered with her perfumes. This normalization was crucial. It made morphine part of the domestic routine, no more suspect than the corset or the corsage. By 1890, the morphine habit had become a quiet epidemic among women of leisure. Doctors noticed it. Priests whispered about it, but no one intervened publicly. To expose a morphine user was to risk social scandal, and so the problem remained behind closed doors. Servants, often the only witnesses, spoke of their mistresses, of evening treatments, or of the peculiar stillness that came after dinner. One chambermaid, interviewed decades later, recalled how she would prepare the syringe and then wait outside the door until her mistress rang the bell twice. The signal that all was well. Some of the women who used morphine were widows, numbed by loss. Others were newly married, overwhelmed by duty. A few were artists, pianists, or writers seeking inspiration or escape. The drug created a strange fraternity among them, a silent sorority of the anesthetized. They were called, not unkindly, les Maries de la Morphine, the brides of morphine. The phrase appeared first in a French medical journal in 1892 and later found its way into novels and gossip columns. It evoked both dependence and devotion, as though morphine itself had become a kind of invisible husband, both protective and possessive. Not all of Europe's morphine brides were French. In Russia, the habit spread among the nobility after the Russo-Turkish War. Officers brought home their morphine kits from the field, and their wives, suffering from ailments or boredom, took to using them. In Britain, morphine was sold in respectable pharmacies under brand names like tincture of morphia, often without prescription. Queen Victoria herself was known to have used laudanum and opiates during childbirth and illness, which lent the practice an air of royal legitimacy. Even across the Atlantic, American society women followed the European trend. In Boston and New York, morphine was prescribed for everything from menstrual cramps to neurasthenia, a fashionable diagnosis for fatigue of the civilized mind. The historian Caroline Acker once wrote that morphine in the 19th century was not a vice but a technology of repose, a way to maintain composure in a rapidly changing world. And yet, beneath the calm surface there was decay. The tolerance grew, the doses increased. The graceful handwriting in diaries became unsteady. Some women began to withdraw from society entirely. There are accounts of once famous hostesses who ceased holding salons, of duchesses who would not travel without their personal physician, of countesses who spent their days in dim rooms with drawn curtains, lost in the narcotic dream that was both soothing and suffocating. The houses remained beautiful, the music continued, but the quiet spread. One cannot help but imagine the contradictions of those evenings, the clinking of crystal glasses, the smell of violets, the soft laughter of guests, and, somewhere in the distance, a woman seated alone, her hand trembling as she prepared another injection. The morphine did not destroy her body at once. It simply erased the sharpness of life, one measured dose at a time. As Europe approached the turn of the century, whispers of a new generation began to rise. A younger set, impatient, restless, and loud, were already growing wary of their parents' ornate melancholy. They spoke of modernity, speed, electricity, and change. But in those waning years of the Belle Époque, the old world still held its breath. It was a world of chandeliers and shadows, of elegance balanced on the edge of decline. And in the quiet rooms of Paris, Vienna, and Moscow, the morphine brides still slept, their dreams suspended in glass vials and velvet-lined cases. Was their addiction a tragedy of indulgence, or a symptom of a deeper emptiness that wealth could not cure? Could morphine be blamed, or was it merely the mirror reflecting Europe's wariness with itself? You wake, metaphorically, in a room of shadows and embroidered drapes. Somewhere in Paris, the bells of St. Sulpice are tolling, but the sound is faint, distant, as though it comes through water. It is the late 1890s now, and the world outside this room is alive with invention. Electric streetlights hum, trains whistle across the countryside, but inside the air is still. The hour belongs to those who do not wish to feel it passing. The Morphine Brides, Europe's hidden generation of elegant addicts, lived in a strange half-life between the visible and the unseen. They appeared at the opera, at charity balls, at afternoon teas, perfectly composed, their gowns immaculate. Yet in their bedrooms, behind drawn curtains, they followed rituals more private than prayer. A delicate syringe, a folded napkin, a small vial, all arranged on a tray like relics of a personal sacrament. To understand them, one must understand the social cage they inhabited. For the women of the upper classes, Life in the late 19th century was both privileged and suffocating. Their education had been ornamental: music, French, painting, manners. But their purpose was singular: to marry well, host gracefully, and never betray distress. Emotion beyond a gentle melancholy was unseemly. Suffering, when expressed quietly, was a mark of refinement. It was this culture of suppressed feeling that made morphine seem, at first, almost moral. It offered relief without rebellion. A woman could calm her nerves without the vulgarity of drunkenness. It allowed the outward performance of serenity to continue, even when the inner life had grown unbearable. Many of these women had begun their habit under medical supervision. Their doctors, often family physicians, were men of discretion who prescribed morphine for sleeplessness, migraines, or female hysteria. A few drops, a small injection, nothing that seemed dangerous. Some doctors even made house calls to administer the dose themselves, which lent the practice an air of propriety. There are case notes from physicians in Paris and Berlin describing ladies of high station who required daily morphine for what they called épuisement des nerfs, exhaustion of the nerves. But the line between treatment and indulgence blurred quickly. The drug's power was both immediate and insidious. After the first rush of relief came the slow, seductive calm, the sense that all worry had melted away. Pain of body, restlessness of mind, the ache of loneliness, all dissolved into a soft distance. The patient felt herself again, though the self was now chemically redefined. In Vienna, where medical modernity mingled with social performance, morphine circles emerged almost as informal clubs. They met discreetly, small gatherings of women who shared both status and secret. In one account from 1901, a social observer described a tea hour, hosted by Baroness Adelheid von K., in which a silver tray was passed between guests, not with pastries but with ampoules. They spoke of art, music, and travel, their conversation slow and serene. To them, morphine was not degradation. It was sophistication, the modern woman's quiet companion. Servants played a key role in this hidden world. Discretion was expected, loyalty rewarded. Maids learned to prepare the injection kits, to sterilize the needles in boiling water, to keep the supply replenished. In large households, the task often fell to the lady's maid, who was paid extra for her silence. Letters and memoirs written decades later by former servants describe the quiet choreography of their mistresses: dependence, the drawn curtains in midday, the faint smell of antiseptic, the hours spent staring into nothing. Not every morphine bride was idle or frivolous. Some were artists, trapped in the double bind of creativity and social duty. The poet Anna de Noailles, for instance, wrote verses that hinted at exhaustion and ethereal detachment. Though her own use of morphine remains uncertain, her circle was filled with those who sought chemical solace. The painter Marie Laurencin later recalled evenings in which the air of the room was heavy with ether and perfume, as if everyone wished to disappear gently. For some, morphine was intertwined with love. Romantic affairs, particularly adulterous ones, were both thrilling and perilous in high society. When relationships ended or reputations were threatened, doctors prescribed morphine for shock. The drug became a quiet way to heal broken hearts without public collapse. A Parisian memoir from 1898 recounts how a marquise, abandoned by her lover, took to her injections with greater devotion than she had ever shown to God. Her decline was polite, her death from overdose described euphemistically as a failure of the heart. As the century turned, Europe's relationship with medicine was shifting. Laboratories were advancing, hospitals were modernizing, and the boundary between science and consumption grew hazy. The same companies that sold morphine also sold cosmetics, tonics, and patent remedies. In Germany, Bayer, then a young pharmaceutical firm, was marketing both aspirin and a new non-addictive cough suppressant. Its trade name was heroin. The irony would not be recognized until later, when heroin itself became the replacement vice of those trying to quit morphine. Among the Morphine Brides, this transition was both tragic and logical. Those seeking to free themselves from morphine were sometimes prescribed heroin instead, believing it to be milder. A doctor in Vienna wrote in 1902 that several of his patients exchanged one demon for another, and in their gratitude, did not notice the chains had changed shape, not weight. In the social press, rumors began to circulate. The phrase morphine entered popular usage, often tinged with gossip and fascination. Satirical journals depicted elegant women with syringes in their handbags, but open discussion was rare. To accuse a lady of morphinism was to question her virtue, and in a world where appearances were everything, silence remained the rule. A few exceptions broke through. In 1897, the French novelist Jules Clarity published La Morphine, a fictionalized account of aristocratic addiction. Though the story was scandalous, its details were painfully familiar to those who lived them. The novel's heroine, a countess named Renée, begins using morphine after the death of her child. Her descent is slow, marked by beauty and paralysis. She was not destroyed. Clarity wrote, she was dissolved. The public read with morbid curiosity, unaware that many of their neighbors were living the same quiet disintegration. Meanwhile, in sanatoriums and private clinics across Europe, the medical response was taking form. By 1900, specialized morphine treatment centers had opened in Berlin, Zurich, and Nice. They were discreet and expensive, catering to the upper classes. Patients were promised detoxification without disgrace. The treatments varied, some used gradual reduction, others employed harsh methods, isolation, forced abstinence, and the administration of new drugs like atropine. Few were truly successful. The return to morphine was common, the relapse rate nearly total. Inside these clinics, the gender divide was evident. Men, often military officers, doctors, or artists, were treated as tragic victims of modernity. Women were described as fragile, hysterical, or morally weak. The term morphinisme féminin carried a stigma distinct from the male condition. A woman's addiction was seen as a flaw in character, not circumstance. And so, many preferred to suffer privately rather than face public shame. There were exceptions. One of the most documented cases was that of the Austrian pianist Maria Tarnowska, whose morphine use intertwined with a life of scandal, love affairs, and eventual murder trial in Venice. Her story, sensationalized by newspapers in 1907, cast her as both villain and victim, the archetype of the morphine use fatale. Though extreme, her case reflected a broader truth. Morphine blurred the boundaries between illness and identity, dependence and defiance. For the majority of the brides, however, there was no drama, only the slow erosion of vitality. The diaries of an Englishwoman, Lady Eleanor F., preserved by her descendants, describe a life reduced to intervals between injections. Her handwriting fades across the pages, a little relief, then the veil returns. Her last entry, in 1903, ends mid-sentence. By the turn of the 20th century, morphine addiction among women had become a public health concern, though still spoken of in whispers. The French medical journal La Presse Médicale estimated that 1 in 50 women of society status in Paris was dependent on morphine. Yet the same issue of the journal contained advertisements for morphine-based cough syrups and pain tablets, available without prescription. The contradiction persisted. Society both condemned and consumed. Culturally, the Morphine Bride became a symbol of the fading century, the beautiful ghost of the Belle Epoque. Artists painted her as pale and languid, wrapped in lace, gazing through half-closed eyes. Poets described her as the muse of decadence, suspended between pleasure and oblivion. In this way, diction was aestheticized, transformed into art, and thus made more tolerable to a society unwilling to confront its own dependency on illusion. But time was changing. The new century brought sharper lines, faster machines, louder lives. The world was no longer content to dream. The young spoke of progress, suffrage, socialism, and science. Against this backdrop, the Morphine Bride seemed relics, soft echoes of a quieter past. Their decline mirrored that of the aristocracy itself, elegant, slow, and inevitable. By 1905, many of the old salons had closed. The last great hostesses were aging, their health failing. The younger generation mocked their fainting couches and scented ampoules. Yet even as the morphine habit waned among the fashionable, it did not disappear. It slipped downward through the classes, from noblemen to clerks, from physicians to soldiers. What had begun as an aristocratic vice would soon become a democratic epidemic, one that war would accelerate beyond imagination. But that is for later. For now, imagine those quiet, curtained rooms once more, the air still, the city outside awakening to modernity. Inside, a woman sits before her mirror, the syringe glinting faintly in the lamplight. She hesitates. For a moment, perhaps, she wonders what life might be without it. But the thought passes. The world resumes its slow blur. The year is 1905. A tram rattles along the Boulevard Saint-Germain, its clatter alien against the old stone facades. The world is speeding up. Automobiles flash by, the telephone rings in parlors that once prized silence, and a restless new century hums with electricity. The old aristocracy still hosts its dinners and recitals, but the atmosphere has changed. There is a feeling, faint but persistent, that something is ending. In the quiet drawing rooms, the Morphine Brides sense it too. They are older now, many in their 40s or 50s, their faces pale beneath powder, their hands delicate but unsteady. Some have attempted to stop, others no longer pretend. The morphine, once a gentle companion, has become a necessity as fixed as breathing. It dulls not only pain but memory itself. Whole hours vanish, days dissolve into ritual, medical attitudes have hardened. The same doctors who once prescribed morphine as a civilized sedative now speak of it as a woman's rune. The new field of psychiatry classifies dependence as moral weakness. Clinics multiply, offering curers that are brutal in their optimism. Women are sent to institutions where morphine is abruptly withdrawn, replaced by purgatives, cold baths, or injections of atropine that cause delirium and vomiting. Many do not complete the treatment. Some return home frail, shaken, resolved to begin again, until the next sleepless night. A case from Vienna in 1908 describes Baroness Hedwig von E., who entered a private hospital for morphine withdrawal. After 10 days without the drug, she begged her doctor for single drop, only to rest. He refused. That night she escaped barefoot into the snow and was found the next morning unconscious outside the gatehouse. The incident was recorded clinically, without emotion. The Baroness survived, but returned to morphine within the month. Meanwhile, outside the private tragedies of these women, Europe itself begins to tilt toward catastrophe. The great powers are arming. The balance that held since Waterloo trembles. In 1914, the guns fire. The First World War explodes across the continent, and morphine, once a parlor vice, becomes a military necessity again. Hospitals overflow with wounded men. Surgeons work without pause, their hands cramped around syringes. Millions of doses of morphine are produced, distributed, injected. The drug of aristocratic sorrow becomes the drug of industrial pain. For the Morphine Brides, the war is both calamity and concealment. Their private dependence is no longer scandalous, it is commonplace. Pharmacies are requisitioned, but army doctors and nurses smuggle vials home for personal relief. Many of the younger women who might have followed in their mother's footsteps are now serving as volunteer nurses. The Hongles of Mercy, who, in secret, become patients themselves. A generation of women learns the needle's quiet comfort amid the screams of the battlefield. The war transforms everything it touches. The old order collapses under its weight. Monarchies fall, empires dissolve. The aristocracy that once defined Europe's elegance disintegrates into exile, bankruptcy, and mourning. Their palaces become hospitals, their jewelry sold for survival. The Morphine Brides, those relics of a vanished age, watch from behind curtained windows as the world they knew crumbles. Some adapt, trading satin gowns for black dresses, salons for small apartments. Others fade quietly. Their morphine supplies, once ordered in engraved boxes, now come through chemists and black market dealers. The purity declines, the doses grow uncertain. Addiction, once aesthetic, becomes squalid. Morphine no longer symbolizes refinement, it signals failure. Society has moved on, but the brides have nowhere to go. A few attempt redemption through charity. In Paris, the Duchess Di converts part of her Echtel particulier into a nursing home for soldiers. She continues to take her medicine, but tells herself it is for strength, not pleasure. In her letters, she writes of the boys who return without legs, who still smile when given their injection. The line between care and complicity blurs. The war ends in 1918, but the peace is restless. Europe is poorer, greyer, scarred. The survivors, soldiers, widows, refugees, share a collective exhaustion that echoes the private despair of the earlier Morphine Brides. Morphine, cocaine, and the new barbiturates circulate freely. The very drug that once numbed the aristocracy now spreads through the masses. The Morphine Bride becomes the morphine widow and finally, the morphine citizen. Governments begin to legislate. In 1912, the Hague Opium Convention had already proposed restrictions, but enforcement arrives only after the war. By 1919, under the League of Nations oversight, the international trade in opiates is curtailed. Pharmacies are inspected. Prescriptions are monitored. The elegant secrecy that once defined the habit disappears under bureaucracy. Morphine is no longer a private indulgence. It is a controlled substance. For the women who remain dependent, life narrows further. Some seek treatment under the new scientific methods, a mixture of psychology and strict abstinence. Others retreat entirely from public life. In the archives of a Swiss sanatorium near Montreux lies a ledger entry dated April 1920. Madame L. Morphinism of long duration. Patient calm, polite, resigned. No further notes. She died that autumn, her fortune gone, her name forgotten. Yet the legacy of the Morphine Brides lingers, faint as their perfume. The aesthetic they embodied, languor, fragility, emotional detachment, seeps into modern culture. The 1920s will idolize the pale, distant woman, the flapper with kohl-rimmed eyes and careless grace. She dances to jazz, drinks gin instead of injecting morphine, but the pose is similar, a refusal to feel too deeply. The numbness has become fashion once again. Historians later debate whether these women were victims of circumstance or symbols of their age. Some argue they were casualties of medical ignorance. Others see them as pioneers of the modern condition, people overwhelmed by speed, progress, and self-awareness. Their addiction, stripped of scandal, reveals a truth about the century, that the pursuit of comfort can become its own captivity. From the distant vantage of today, their lives appear both beautiful and sad, like faded photographs of gardens that no longer exist. One sees the lace sleeves, the marble mantels, the mirrored salons, and behind it all, the quiet despair of those who had everything except purpose. Imagine, for a moment, one of the last Morphine Brides, perhaps a countess living alone in a small flat on the right bank around 1920. The walls are bare, the servants are gone. The city outside hums with motorcars and American jazz. She sits by the window, the evening light cold and blue. On the table lies a small case, its velvet worn thin. Inside a syringe, a vial, a folded cloth. Her hands tremble slightly as she prepares the dose. It is not pleasure she seeks now, nor even peace. Only the familiarity of the ritual, the quiet certainty that, for a few hours, the noise of the new world will fade. She presses the plunger. The city blurs. In that moment, time folds back. The chandeliers, the laughter, the warmth of long-vanished salons return in memory. She breathes once, twice, and the century moves on without her. By the 1920s, public attention has shifted elsewhere, to new wars of economy, to politics, to jazz and machines. The Morphine Brides vanish from record, absorbed into the long shadow of history. Their bottles are emptied, their diaries closed, their portraits auctioned. Yet their influence lingers quietly in medicine's cautious respect for addiction, in the psychology of anesthesia, in our modern fascination with the line between care and craving. They were, in their way, the first moderns, people who sought in chemistry the same escape we now seek in distraction. Their world collapsed in velvet silence, but its echo persists. And so, the Morphine Brides of the Belle Époque leave behind not a scandal, but a question. Was their descent a symptom of decadence, or an early warning that even in times of peace and beauty, the human heart will find its own wars to fight? You are standing in Paris in the summer of 1832. The air is thick, not with perfume, but with smell. The Seine glistens under the sun, yet it is no river of romance. It is greenish, sluggish, and full of refuse human waste, animal carcasses, laundry runoff, and everything the city prefers not to see. The odor is overwhelming. It hangs between buildings, seeps through windows, and settles in the fabrics of clothing. Paris, the city of light, is also a city of rot. In the early 19th century, sanitation was a matter of improvisation. Houses emptied their chamber pots into gutters that ran down the middle of streets. Some wealthier homes had cesspits, deep stone-lined holes beneath courtyards, which were emptied by men called vidangers, or night soil workers. They labored mostly after dark, hauling waste through the sleeping city. Their work was dangerous, their pay low, and their presence unwelcome. Yet without them, Paris would have drowned in its own filth. This was an age before plumbing, before germ theory, before the modern concept of hygiene. Illness moved invisibly through the air and water. People did not yet know that cholera, the disease that would soon devastate Europe, was waterborne. They blamed the stench itself, the miasma. When the cholera epidemic struck in 1832, it killed over 19,000 Parisians in just 6 months, roughly 1 in every 20 inhabitants. The poor suffered most. In the narrow alleys of the Allées de la Cité and the Faubourg Saint-Marcel, the sick lay on straw pallets, and doctors, unable to explain the contagion, fled. The smell of lime and death filled the city. The crisis forced officials to confront what they had long ignored, that a modern city could not survive without a modern sewer. Yet the problem was immense. Paris had grown without plan, its medieval streets twisting like roots. Beneath them lay a tangle of drains, some centuries old, some newly added, that carried rainwater but not sewage. These early tunnels were uneven, often blocked, and emptied directly into the Seine. Cleaning them required men to crawl through the muck with lanterns and shovels. Into this chaos stepped a civil engineer named Eugène Belgrand, a man of precision, patience, and vision. When Baron Haussmann, the prefect of the Seine, was tasked by Napoleon III to modernize Paris, Belgrand became his chief engineer for water and sanitation. Together they would rebuild not just the surface of the city, the grand boulevards, the parks, the symmetry, but its hidden anatomy. Belgrand was meticulous. He believed that the health of a city was no less important than its beauty. Under his guidance, the Paris sewer system was expanded, rationalized, and mapped. Each new boulevard houseman cut through the old neighborhoods was mirrored below by a corresponding sewer tunnel, wide, arched, and engineered with almost architectural grace. The new tunnels were not merely functional. They were designed to be visited, inspected, admired. Their walls were lined with stone, their curves exact, lamps illuminated the flow of water, and walkways allowed workers to move through them safely. For Belgrade, cleanliness was civilization. But progress came slowly. In the 1840s, the work was arduous and unpopular. Taxpayers balked at the cost. Landlords complained about disruptions. The laborers themselves, known as aiguetiers, were drawn from the city's poorest quarters. They descended daily into a world without sunlight, surrounded by perpetual dampness and odor. The aiguetiers became a kind of invisible class, vital yet unseen. Their work required courage and endurance. They navigated in darkness, often waist deep in flowing waste, armed with long poles to test depth and rakes to clear blockages. Accidents were common: cave-ins, gas suffocation, and sudden surges of floodwater. Yet they took pride in their labor. The sewers were their world, and they called themselves with grim humor les enfants du dessous, the children of below. By 1850, the transformation was visible. The cholera outbreaks began to recede. The Seine, though still far from clean, no longer reeked as it once had. Paris was learning to breathe again. Above ground, the boulevards widened, fountains flowed, and the empire flourished. Below ground, the city's arteries carried away its waste in steady silence. And yet, not everyone celebrated the new order. Writers and poets lamented the loss of the old, chaotic Paris, the labyrinth of smells and sensations. Victor Hugo, in Les Miserables 1862, would later immortalize the sewers as a metaphor for both filth and redemption, describing them as a conscience in which the monstrous wretchedness of civilization discharges itself. Hugo's words, though grand, were not exaggeration. The sewers were indeed a mirror of the city above, its sins, its waste, its unseen labor. Every loaf of bread eaten, every candle burned, every body bathed left a trace that descended into the tunnels. And there the aiguiers tended to it day after day, unseen but indispensable. By the 1850s, Belgrade's designs had become reality: miles of tunnels mapped and labeled, accessible by stairways from the streets above. For the first time, the city's sanitation was not an embarrassment but a point of pride. In 1855, the Exposition Universelle, Paris's great world fair, included a guided tour of the new sewers. Visitors from across Europe descended into the tunnels, riding in small boats by lantern light. They marveled at the cleanliness, the engineering, the quiet order of the underworld. The irony was exquisite. What had once been hidden in shame was now displayed as progress. Paris had turned its waste into a symbol of modernity. Still, life for the workers below did not change much. Their clothes were waterproofed with tar, their boots never quite dried. They carried with them small lamps and flasks of brandy, not for comfort, but to mask the stench. Some grew superstitious, believing the tunnels haunted by les esprits du dessous, the spirits of those who had drowned or suffocated in years past. Others treated their work as a kind of calling, taking pride in keeping the city clean even when no one noticed. One aiguetier interviewed in 1860 said simply, "Above, they live by light. Below, we live by duty." As the century advanced, the Paris sewer became more than infrastructure. It became legend. Guidebooks began to include it among the city's curiosities. Writers described it as a hidden cathedral, a world of shadows beneath the light. The romance of decay turned practical engineering into myth. Yet beneath the myth, the truth remained, the slow, patient labor that kept millions alive. For every glittering evening at the Opie Regania, there were hundreds of men below ensuring that Paris's waste did not rise back to the surface. And so, as the 1850s gave way to the 1860s, and the modern city took shape, the paradox deepened. Civilization, in all its beauty, depended on what lay unseen beneath it. The people of Paris could now walk its boulevards in confidence, unaware that their footsteps echoed above the silent rivers of their own making. But how long could this delicate balance between beauty and filth, progress and decay, be maintained? What would happen when the underground city began to mirror the corruption and strain of the one above? If you could step into the Paris of 1867, the year of the Second Great Exposition Universelle, you would find yourself in a city transformed. Broad avenues, gas lamps glowing in the mist, carriages gliding between stone faiades. The air still carried traces of smoke and coal dust, but the old odor of decay had faded into something faint, distant, almost nostalgic. The sewers, vast, silent, and meticulously organized, stretched for more than 600 kilometers beneath the capital. They were mapped with military precision. Each tunnel bore a name corresponding to the street above. the Rue de Rivoli above, the Aiguette de Rivoli below. The system was so precise that one could, in theory, navigate all of Paris underground, following the same logic of the surface. But the real story of the sewers was not the engineering. It was the people who lived, or rather worked, within them. The Égoutiers of the Second Empire were a peculiar fraternity. They were not admired, nor were they despised. They existed at the edge of society, somewhere between laborers and ghosts. To the Parisians above, they were invisible, yet to themselves, they were indispensable. Their day began at dawn. At the entrance on the Quai d'Orsay or near the Pont de l'Alma, they would gather with shovels, hooks, oil lamps, and waterproofed coats. The smell of tar and damp cloth hung in the air. Each man was assigned a section of tunnel to inspect, a gallery, as they called it, and descended the iron staircase into the half-darkness below. The tunnels were dimly lit by oil lamps fixed to the walls, their light glimmering on wet stone. The air was heavy, humid, and warm, carrying the faint echo of running water. To newcomers, it felt suffocating. To veterans, it was home. A newcomer might gag on the stench, but an experienced égoutier could identify problems by smell alone. A sharp, sour tang indicated fermentation. A metallic odor suggested gas. An earthy rot meant blockage. The men developed what one inspector called a second nose, an instinct for danger. And danger was everywhere. Methane gas could accumulate silently, waiting for a single spark. Rats swarmed in the darker corners, feeding on scraps washed down from kitchens above. Flooding could arrive without warning, especially during heavy rain when the tunnels filled rapidly. The most feared were les crues de la Seine, the great floods when the river rose and the entire network became a trap. In those moments, the égoutiers relied on an old, grim tradition. When the waters came too fast to flee, they climbed to the nearest ladder, hung their coats on the top rung, and waited. If the water reached the coat, it was time to pray. Despite the dangers, the men below developed a deep camaraderie. Their work demanded trust. A single mistake could endanger everyone in a tunnel. They worked in pairs or small teams, communicating through whistles and shouts that echoed down the curved stone corridors. Their language was full of slang, a dialect all their own. The flow is angry, meant a blockage ahead. The air sleeps, warned of gas. They also carried with them rituals. On their first day, a new worker was splashed deliberately with sewer water, a crude baptism marking his entry into the brotherhood. Meals were eaten underground, often bread and cheese, wrapped in wax paper. They drank water drawn from cleaner conduits, or occasionally wine, diluted and warmed by the tunnel's heat. Above ground, Parisians hardly thought of them. And yet, by the 1870s, the égoutiers had become a curiosity, even a symbol of modernity. Tourists visiting the Exposition Universelle were invited to tour the sewers by boat. The guides were often the workers themselves, dressed in clean uniforms, their usual tools replaced with polished lanterns. They spoke with quiet pride of their world. Mark Twain, visiting in the 1870s, took the tour and wrote of it with astonishment. He described the tunnels as majestic and impressive, and the workers as clean, sober, and intelligent. It seemed that even in filth, Paris managed to produce something elegant. But beneath this fascination lay an uncomfortable truth. The glamour of Paris rested on the labor of men who spent their lives knee-deep in its waste. For every fine dinner in the cafes of the Grands Boulevards, for every perfume sold in a shop window, something else was being carried away below, quietly, efficiently, invisibly. By the 1880s, the sewer system had grown into a complex organism. There were water conduits, drainage lines, maintenance tunnels, and even telegraph cables strung along the walls. Inspectors moved through on small rail carts, and boats transported workers or supplies. The underground city had its own order, its own rhythm. At the Port d'Austerlitz, a central maintenance depot, engineers logged daily reports in ledgers so meticulous that they read almost like chronicles. Flow regular, odor moderate. One might say, blockage near Rue du Bac cleared at 4:50 p.m., noted another. These were not dramatic stories, yet they recorded the heartbeat of a city. The égoutiers became, in a way, the chroniclers of Paris's underworld. They found strange things in the flow: coins, jewelry, letters, shoes, bones. Sometimes they found more. In 1882, a team working beneath the Rue Saint-Honoré discovered a small chest washed into a junction. Inside were papers belonging to a banker accused of fraud. The missing evidence in a much publicized trial. The newspapers called it a miracle of the sewers. Such finds only deepened the myth of the tunnels. Novelists began to use them as settings for intrigue and mystery. Tourists asked if the égoutiers ever found bodies, and the workers, ever pragmatic, replied simply, sometimes. Yet for all their grim work, there was dignity in what they did. By the 1880s, the sewer workers of Paris were organized, disciplined, and relatively well paid compared to other laborers. They received uniforms, pensions, and health care, small rewards for their dangerous duty. The government even recognized them officially as fonctionnaires municipaux, municipal officers. The title carried pride. In their modest homes on the city's outskirts, Gautiers kept photographs of themselves in uniform, standing proudly beside the sewer entrances where they worked. Their children grew up knowing that their fathers were protectors of the city, even if their work remained unseen. Still, the tunnels shaped them. Many developed chronic coughs, joint pain, or skin conditions from the dampness. Some grew superstitious. They said that the tunnels had moods, that some days they breathed easily, while others they grumbled. And sometimes, when the air was too still, they spoke of hearing whispers. Echoes of old Paris, voices of those who had gone before. It may sound fanciful, but after decades below ground, reality blurred. The world above became distant, unreal. A veteran Gautier once remarked, "Up there the streets change every year. Down here they are eternal." By the late 19th century, the Paris sewer system had become a model for cities worldwide. London, Vienna, and New York sent delegations to study it. The system's combination of engineering elegance and human efficiency was unmatched. Yet it was also a reflection of a society learning to control what it once feared. Its own waste, its own decay, and perhaps that control was an illusion. Because as Paris expanded and modernized, new pressures emerged. Industrial runoff, chemical waste, and population growth strained even Belgrin's grand design. The tunnels that once carried rainwater and sewage began to overflow more frequently. The Gautiers noticed it first. They always did. In the journals of the period, one can find their warnings. Pressure increasing near the Saint Martin Basin. Backflow reported near Montmartre. But officials, preoccupied with politics and spectacle, paid little heed. The underground murmured with signs of strain, but the city above was too busy celebrating itself. And so, beneath the beauty of the Belle Epoque, the balance that had made Paris a modern marvel was beginning, imperceptibly, to shift. The Gautiers kept working as they always had, unaware that their quiet world would soon face its greatest test. The year was 1910. The sign was rising, and for the first time in nearly a century, the City of Light would discover what happened when its hidden veins overflowed. You awaken to the sound of dripping. It is the middle of January 1910, and the city of Paris is cold and grey. Snow has melted into slush. The sign has been rising for days, quietly, almost politely at first. The newspapers mention it, but few are alarmed. The river often swells in winter. It is a rhythm the city knows well. But this year, the rhythm is off. For weeks, rain has fallen steadily across northern France. The Yonne, the Marne, and the Seine, all swollen tributaries, converge upon Paris like veins filling a heart too quickly. The ground is saturated. The air smells faintly of mold and wet earth. And below the streets, in the endless maze of tunnels, the Gautiers feel it first. At the Bassin de la Villette, water begins to seep through the joints in the walls. Tiny leaks become rivulets. The men patch them with rags and cement, but the pressure grows. One records in his journal, the water does not obey anymore. By the 18th of January, the Seine has risen 4 meters above normal. The current moves fast, brown and thick with debris. At the Pont de l'Alma, the famous statue of the Zouave, a soldier in stone, stands waist deep in water. Parisians, amused at first, use him to measure the flood. When it reaches his shoulders, they joke, we'll start to worry. 3 days later, they stop laughing. The water has reached his chest. The sewers, once the pride of modern engineering, are now betraying their creators. Designed to drain the city into the Seine, they are now carrying the river back into the city, through thousands of small openings, drains, basins, cellar vents. The flood seeps upward. It is as though Paris is being drowned from below. In the tunnels, the Gautiers work by lantern light, wading through rising water. They know these galleries intimately, but now even they are disoriented. The normal flow is reversed. The air is heavy with gas and panic. It is the Seine herself, one says, taking back what we have stolen. At the Gare d'Orsay, the basement feels like a basin. Electrical cables hiss and spark. The telegraph lines flicker, then die. By the 26th of January, the floodwaters have risen through manholes in the streets. Policemen patrol in boots. Boats replace carriages on the Rue de Lille. In the Quartier Latin, the cellars of cafes and bookshops are submerged. Wine casks float like buoys. Rats, flushed from the sewers, scurry through the streets in broad daylight. The newspapers call it le déluge, the deluge. But there is no chaos, not yet. The Parisians, ever proud, adapt with peculiar calm. Soldiers erect wooden walkways between buildings. Neighbors help one another ferry food and coal. The bakeries continue to bake, the cafes continue to serve coffee. Even in crisis, Paris insists on its routines. Still, the situation worsens. By January 26th, the sign stands nearly 9 meters above normal, a level unseen in 2 centuries. Entire districts are submerged. The Gare Saint-Lazare is closed, its tracks underwater. Thousands are forced from their homes. The underground, the pride of Belgrade's century, becomes a vast, murky sea. The aiguetiers now serve as rescuers, guides, and repairmen. They navigate the flooded tunnels in makeshift boats, checking valves and reinforcing walls. They move by instinct, by memory of curves and slopes. The water is icy, the air foul. One team reports rowing beneath the Rue de Rivoli, their lanterns reflecting on a ceiling they can barely see. Above ground, the city seems strangely silent. Gaslights flicker in the fog. The hum of industry is replaced by the splash of oars. The great boulevards of Haussmann's empire have become canals. At night, when the city sleeps uneasily, the aiguetiers continue their work. They carry sandbags through tunnels, build barriers at junctions, and pray that the pressure does not burst the walls. The system was never meant for such strain. In one tunnel near the Pont de l'Archevêché, a collapse occurs. The ceiling caves in with a deep, echoing roar. 3 men are trapped for hours before being pulled free. Their faces are black with mud, their eyes wide. They say they heard the river breathing. The engineers above do what they can. Pumps are installed, valves closed, water redirected. But the truth is inescapable. The sewers, for all their grandeur, have become conduits of disaster. And yet there is no rebellion, no despair, only endurance. The newspapers praise the calm of the citizens. One headline reads, "Paris in the hands of water," but not of panic. Artists sketch the flooded streets. Children play in boats made of barrels. And down below, the aiguetiers keep watch, uncelebrated, invisible. On January 28th, the river begins to stabilize. The Zouave's head remains above water. The worst has passed, but the damage is immense. Hundreds of kilometers of tunnels ruined, bridges weakened, thousands of homes uninhabitable. The city that once prided itself on its mastery over nature has been humbled. In the weeks that follow, the cleanup begins. Mud covers everything, streets, walls, cellars. The smell of damp stone and rot fills the air again, as it had 80 years earlier. The work is slow, repetitive, thankless. Pumps roar day and night. Men with shovels move mountains of silt. And among them, as always, are the aiguetiers. They rebuild quietly, sealing cracks, reinforcing arches, restoring the arteries of the city. Tourists will later come again to marvel at the system, but by then, the men who saved it will have long returned to anonymity. Eugène Belgrand himself did not live to see the flood. He had died decades earlier, his vision complete, his name carved into the stone plaques of the tunnels. Yet his legacy, both triumph and flaw, endured. The sewers had made Paris a model of modern hygiene, but they had also made it vulnerable. The city's beauty depended, as ever, on balance. The river must flow but not rise. The sewers must drain but not betray. In the years that followed, new engineering reforms were introduced. Floodgates were added, pumping stations strengthened, and warning systems devised. The aiguetiers gained renewed respect, their work briefly visible to the world. And yet, as the decades passed, the memory faded. The flood of 1910 became another chapter in the long story of Paris, told in postcards, paintings, and anecdotes, but rarely in gratitude for those who labored unseen. Today, if you walk along the Seine near the Pont de l'Alma, you can still see the Zouave statue. His uniform has been cleaned, his gaze unchanged. When the water rises to his boots, Parisians smile and say, "It is only a little flood." When it reaches his knees, they grow cautious, and when it climbs to his chest, they remember, faintly, that once the city nearly drowned. But down below, the tunnels remain as they were, dark, damp, methodical. The lamps hum softly, the water runs endlessly. The aiguetiers, their descendants still working in shifts, walk the same paths, carrying the same tools, breathing the same heavy air. They check the valves, clear the grates, and listen for the subtle sound of imbalance. For them, the flood of 1910 is not history. It is a warning, because they know better than anyone that civilization is not built upon monuments or boulevards, but upon what lies beneath. The quiet systems that no one sees, the men who work without applause, the fragile balance between order and chaos. Paris, the city of light, still stands because of its shadows. And those shadows, patient and silent, still breathe through the veins of stone beneath your feet. The sewers are no longer a marvel, nor a spectacle. They are simply there, as essential as forgotten, as the blood beneath your skin. And perhaps that is how civilization truly endures, not in brilliance, but in the steady rhythm of the unseen. The river outside murmurs as it always has. The tunnels sigh eternal, and Paris, bright, proud, and fragile, sleeps above them once more. If you stand in Prague's Old Town Square today, you will find the air humming with tourists and pigeons. The square opens like a great stone book, cobbled streets fanning outward, spires pricking the sky, and on the southern wall of the Old Town Hall, a piece of machinery that has ticked through 6 centuries. The horloge, the Prague astronomical clock. It is one of the oldest functioning mechanical clocks in the world. But to the people who built it, it was more than a machine. It was a prayer made of brass and patience. Let us step back to the beginning, the early 1400s, when Prague was the seat of kings and theologians, merchants and masons, and a restless kind of faith. The city was alive with argument. The old order of the church was being questioned, scholars spoke of reform, and yet, everywhere, the rhythm of life was still marked by bells, by hours, by masses, by curfews. Time was not yet measured for convenience but for salvation. To live rightly meant to move in rhythm with heaven. And so, in that century, the idea of a clock that could not only tell time but display the universe itself took root. At the heart of this story is a man whose name flickers between legend and record, Michael of Kadau, a clockmaker and craftsman working under the supervision of Jan A. Indel, a scholar and astronomer at Charles University. Together, around the year 1410, they built something extraordinary, a clock that would mark not just hours, but cosmic order. The horloge was installed on the wall of the Old Town Hall, its face a map of heaven and earth. At its center, a golden sun and moon trace their paths against a field of blue and black, showing both the time of day and the motion of celestial bodies. The zodiac ring rotated slowly, marking the passage of months, and beneath it, a simpler dial, the calendar plate, turned once per year, showing the names of saints and feast days. It was, in essence, the cosmos reduced to gears. Imagine standing before it in the year 1410. The world was not yet mapped. The stars were still divine, the heavens alive with mystery. To see the sun move mechanically before your eyes was to glimpse the machinery of God. Each part of the clock was symbolic. The golden hand traced not merely hours, but the eternal order. The painted figures, saints, angels, the skeletal figure of death, served as moral reminders. Every tick was an echo of divine rhythm. In an age of parchment and plague, this was nothing short of a miracle. But miracles require maintenance. The horloge was not a simple device that could be wound and left. It was a complex, temperamental creature of wood and iron that demanded constant care. Its gears had to be oiled, its weights balanced, its astronomical tables recalculated. And so began a lineage of men, caretakers, repairers, engineers, who would keep it alive through war, fire, and neglect. The first of these were the early clockmasters of Prague, whose names survive only in city ledgers: Michael of Kadau, later Jan Rbe, also known as Hanuv, and then a long succession of men who inherited not wealth, but obligation. For the clock was both civic pride and divine duty. When it stopped, and it often did, people whispered of omens. A silent clock was a city without blessing. The town council would summon the clockmaker in haste, and he would climb the narrow stairs of the tower, carrying oil, files, and patience. There, among the dust and gears, he would work for hours, coaxing the mechanism back to motion. It was lonely work. The tower was cold in winter and sweltering in summer. The gears moved slowly, stubbornly. Each repair required listening, literally, to the rhythm of time. The good clockmaker could hear a fault before he could see it: a tooth misaligned, a spring too tight, a weight dragging unevenly. In this way, the horloge trained generations of men in humility, but humility was not always rewarded. Sometime in the late 15th century, perhaps around 1490, the legend arose of Master Hanuv, a gifted clockmaker, so skilled that the city feared he might recreate his masterpiece elsewhere. The story says that the council, in its envy, ordered him blinded to ensure the horloge remained unique. In revenge, he is said to have crippled the clock before dying, cursing it forever. It is almost certainly myth, yet it tells us something true: that the clock, though made of metal, inspired reverence and fear. For the people of Prague, it was more than a civic ornament. It was the city's heart. To see its dials move was to know that order still existed that time, and by extension, fate was in motion. Every hour, the clock performed its ritual. The small wooden doors opened, and the figures of the 12 apostles passed by in procession. Death, in skeletal form, rang his bell. Vanity admired himself in a mirror. Greed clutched his purse. The rooster crowed. The crowd below watched in silence, half in amusement, half in awe. The entire performance lasted less than a minute, but it embodied centuries of belief. That time was moral, that the universe itself could be read as a lesson. And yet, beneath the beauty, there was drudgery. The mechanism needed wending twice a day. Dust had to be cleared from the escapement. The iron weights had to be lifted by hand, heavy, cumbersome, unforgiving. And when frost set in, the gears contracted. When heat came, they expanded. The clock was a living thing, its moods as changeable as weather. Records from the city archives show constant expenditures. To the repair of the clock, 2 groschen. To the cleaning of the dial, 1 florin. To the keeper of the tower, for oil and lamp, ½ mark. The machine was not eternal, it was perpetually on the edge of failure. Still, the people believed in it. In a world without certainty, the slow turning of the horloge was reassurance. Empires might rise and fall, kings might be crowned and deposed, but the sun and moon on the clock would continue their patient dance. And that faith, not in the church or crown, but in mechanism, was something new. The horloge represents one of the earliest moments when humans began to trust machines to order their world. It was the dawn of mechanized faith, belief in precision, in maintenance, in the quiet perfection of gears. As the 15th century turned to the 16th, Prague's clock became a symbol of identity. Travelers wrote of it in diaries, painters depicted it in cityscapes. It stood as proof that human ingenuity could reflect divine harmony, but the harmony was fragile. The Hussite Wars, which ravaged Bohemia in the early 15th century, left scars across the city. The clock survived them, barely, but it was damaged, repaired, and damaged again. Every war, every fire, every neglect threatened it, and each time some patient craftsman restored it, 1 tooth and gear at a time. Their names are mostly lost, yet their labor endures in the ticking that still echoes through the square today. By 1490, the horloge had already become old. Its paint was fading, its mechanism outdated. New technologies were emerging elsewhere, spring-driven clocks, portable timepieces. But in Prague, the great astronomical clock remained both relic and heartbeat. And so it ticked on, through frost and plague, its slow rhythm blending with the tolling of church bells, the creak of carts, the murmur of prayers. For the people of that city, time was no abstraction. It was a sound, heavy, metallic, patient. Every hour that passed beneath the gaze of the horloge reminded them of 2 truths: that time was divine, and that all divine things required care. But even the most faithful mechanism can falter, and as the centuries turned, new ideas about science, measurement, and control would begin to change what time itself meant. The horloge would not remain a prayer forever. It would become something else, a clock for a world no longer governed by faith, but by precision. And in that transformation, the clockmakers of Prague would face a new kind of challenge, not how to keep time holy, but how to keep it running at all. By the dawn of the 16th century, the astronomical clock of Prague had already lived longer than its makers. Its paint had dulled to an earthy ochre, its celestial blue faded by soot and rain, yet it still drew crowds. Children were lifted to their parents' shoulders to watch the apostles march in their wooden procession. Merchants timed the opening of their stalls by its chime, but something subtle had shifted. Time, once a matter of divine rhythm, was becoming administrative. The new rulers of Bohemia, of the Habsburgs, saw clocks not as symbols of heaven, but as instruments of control. As empires grew, so did the need for order, armies to be drilled, taxes collected, trains scheduled, citizens registered. The heartbeat of power was no longer the church bell, but the clock tower. And so, across Europe, a quiet revolution began, a revolution of minutes. The bureaucracy of precision in the early modern period. Every major city of the Habsburg realm, from Vienna to Prague, from Budapest to Lviv, installed and maintained large mechanical clocks. They were civic landmarks, but also tools of governance. In Prague, the city council commissioned repeated inspections of the horloge. The minutes of these meetings survive in the archives, terse, careful, bureaucratic. It is decreed that the astronomical clock shall be repaired, and the keeper of the mechanism shall be paid 4 groschen monthly, with additional allowance for oil and wire. The romance of faith had given way to the language of expense and maintenance. Yet the clock still inspired awe. The 16th and 17th centuries were centuries of upheaval, Reformation, Counter-Reformation, and the long shadow of the 30 Years' War. Prague became a city of contrasts: Jesuits and reformers, merchants and beggars, soldiers and scholars. And through all of it, the clock continued to tick. There were years when no one could afford to repair it. Records show gaps. Years where it fell silent. Dust gathered on its dial, cobwebs inside its gears. But each time, a craftsman would appear, summoned from the Guild of Clockmakers, to breathe life back into it. It is tempting to imagine these men, alone in the tower, their hands blackened with oil, their eyes red from candlelight, as guardians of some sacred continuity. But in truth, their work was mechanical, repetitive, often thankless. The 17th century clockmaker was part artisan, part bureaucrat. He was required to report every repair to the city office, submit receipts for every ounce of oil and each length of brass wire. The rhythm of the horloge was mirrored by the rhythm of paperwork. It was no longer faith that kept the clock running, but procedure. The clockmaker's life let us pause and imagine one of these men. Perhaps it is Václav Kadivnek, whose name appears in a record from 1659. His handwriting is careful, almost clerical. He petitions the council for more funds. The clock being of great complexity and most ancient construction, it requires continuous oversight. The brass wheels are much worn. I pray that the Honourable Council will provide for replacement of the iron weights, that the time of the city may not falter. There is no poetry in his request, only fatigue. Kadivnek would have climbed the narrow wooden stairs to the mechanism chamber daily. There, amid the odour of oil and dust, he would wend the great weights with a heavy iron crank. The motion was slow, almost meditative. He would listen to the escapement, the soft click, click of time itself, and check that the gears meshed properly. Each sound told him a story. A faint squeal meant dryness. A dull thud meant misalignment. The clock spoke if one knew how to listen. And then he would descend again, record his work in the ledger, and vanish into the anonymous order of the city. Hundreds of such men passed through that tower over the centuries. None became famous, none were saints. Yet each one, by habit and care, preserved the mechanism that outlived them all. In their patient maintenance lay the secret of the early modern world, a civilization built on repetition. From heaven to measurement by the 18th century, the meaning of the horloge had changed once more. The Enlightenment had come to Prague. Scholars from Vienna brought new instruments, pendulum clocks, barometers, telescopes. To them, the old astronomical clock was an anachronism, a medieval relic with imprecise calculations and outdated cosmology. The Earth no longer sat at the center of the universe, the sun no longer circled it. The zodiac signs painted on the dial represented a cosmos that no longer existed. Yet the clock still worked, and so it remained increasingly decorative, increasingly symbolic, a monument to the patience of an earlier age. But not everyone saw it that way. There were those who continued to find in it a kind of secular faith. Philosophers visiting Prague wrote of the horloge as an emblem of human reason, a mechanism that mirrored the universe not as creation, but as system. Where the medievals had seen divine order, the Enlightenment saw mechanical order. The clock no longer reflected God, but nature. It is difficult to overstate the quiet power of that transformation. When the City Council of Prague restored the horloge in 1791, after decades of neglect, the work was overseen not by theologians but by engineers. They repainted the zodiac ring, re-gilded the sun and moon, and recalibrated the dials according to the new astronomical tables of the time. In that moment, the clock was reborn not as an icon of faith, but as an instrument of science. Time had been secularized, and with that secularization came precision. New gears, new escapements, new measurements. The world itself was being divided into smaller and smaller units. Minutes, seconds, milliseconds, until the very flow of life could be quantified. The horloge, old and cumbersome, could not compete with the accuracy of the new pendulum clocks, yet it endured because of something else, its beauty. Visitors came not to check the time but to watch the performance. The apostles marching, the rooster crowing, death ringing his bell. It had become a ritual, not of faith or empire, but of memory. Empire of ours, the 19th century brought trains. When the first railway reached Prague in the 1840s, the city found itself bound to Vienna by timetable. The empire's pulse now moved by telegraph and locomotive. Local time, once determined by the sun, became standardized. No longer did each city keep its own hours. The empire synchronized, and with synchronization came something unprecedented: uniformity. In 1850, Prague's city council ordered that the horloge be adjusted to match imperial railway time. A small change, bureaucratically worded, but profound. For the first time in its history, the great astronomical clock, built to mirror the heavens, was made to follow a human schedule. The meaning of time had inverted. Where once the heavens dictated the hours, now the empire did. The symbolism would not have been lost on the citizens of Prague. The horloge, once the pulse of divine order, was now a servant of bureaucracy. Its dials, once cosmic, now turned in obedience to train schedules and office hours. And yet, paradoxically, This very subordination gave it new dignity. The people loved the clock not because it was modern, but because it was not. In a world of telegraphs and steam, the horloge represented slowness, continuity, resistance to haste. It ticked at the same pace it always had, the patient rhythm of the 15th century, untouched by industrial urgency. Maintenance and memory, the restoration records from the mid-19th century read almost tenderly. Engineers speak of ancient craftsmanship, of delicate wheels wrought by unknown masters. They repaired it not out of necessity. There were newer clocks everywhere, but out of reverence. To restore the horloge was to touch history itself, to oil the same gears that had turned under the hands of forgotten men. Each screw tightened, each tooth replaced, became an act of continuity. Prague, by then, was no longer the imperial capital it once aspired to be. It was provincial, overshadowed by Vienna. Yet in the quiet persistence of its clock, there was a kind of dignity, the dignity of maintenance, of care without glory. The horloge had become the city's conscience. Every hour, as the figures of vanity, greed, and death moved in their ritual dance, the crowd would gather. Children laughed, soldiers paused, clerks checked their watches. And though they might not say it, everyone knew that the old clock's ticking connected them, not to empire or faith, but to endurance itself. For more than 4 centuries, it had measured the unmeasurable patience. But history is never patient for long. In the century to come, Prague would face fire, war, and occupation. The horloge, that old survivor of empires and reforms, would once again be tested, not by time but by destruction. When the streets filled with smoke in 1945, and the old town hall burned, its gears melted, its dials shattered, its apostles charred, the question arose once more: how many times can a city rebuild the same clock before it becomes something else entirely? By the mid-19th century, the horloge had already seen more empires rise and fall than any human could remember. The astronomical dial, the calendar face, the little wooden apostles, all had been restored so many times that the original craftsmanship was almost impossible to trace. It was a patchwork of centuries ticking. The city around it was changing quickly. Gaslights replaced candles, factories replaced workshops, and time itself began to accelerate. The telegraph lines that ran through Bohemia in the 1860s made the clock's slow movement seem almost quaint. A telegram could cross Europe in seconds, but the horloge still measured the heavens by medieval calculations. And yet it endured. The people of Prague had grown accustomed to its stubborn persistence. Whenever it stopped, crowds would gather below the silent dials, as though waiting for the city's own pulse to resume. Repairmen would appear again with their ladders, grace, and patience. A few hours later, the bell would strike, and applause would ripple through the square. It was as though the clock's fragility made it more beloved. The century of upheaval in 1914, as the Austro-Hungarian Empire stumbled toward war, Prague's square looked much the same as it had for hundreds of years. Pigeons perched on the statues, the faint smell of coal hung in the air, and the clock ticked. Few noticed that its gears, after 5 centuries of motion, had become uneven and weary. The war took its toll not through battle but through neglect. Metal was scarce, many public clocks were dismantled for scrap. The horloge survived only because of local protest. Prague citizens refused to let soldiers strip it. When the empire fell in 1918 and Czechoslovakia was born, the clock was celebrated as a symbol of national endurance. Engineers inspected it again, documenting every tooth and wheel. The new republic was proud of its old mechanism. But time has a way of testing pride. The war and the fire in May 1945, as World War II drew to its chaotic end. Prague erupted in rebellion against German occupation. The old town hall became a stronghold for Czech resistance fighters. For 5 days, the square was a battlefield. German artillery rained shells onto the tower, flames swallowed the wooden interiors. When the fire reached the horloge, the great clock burned. Its wooden apostles, hand-carved in the 17th century, were reduced to ash. The calendar dial, painted by Joseph Menes in 1865, cracked and blackened. The gears fused together, warped by heat. The clock that had measured half a millennium of time fell silent. Photographs from that week show the ruin clearly. The clock face blistered, the tower smoke, stained, the city square strewn with rubble. For a while, the citizens of Prague thought it was gone forever. But almost immediately, whispers of reconstruction began. The rebuilders in 1946, as the war's ruins were being cleared, a small group of engineers and craftsmen formed a committee to restore the clock. They worked in a basement workshop of the National Technical Museum, surrounded by salvaged fragments, bent rods, half-melted gears, shards of glass. The lead engineer was Jaroslav Menkel, a quiet man who had studied medieval mechanisms before the war. He described the task as resurrecting a soul from a box of ashes. The work was slow. Some pieces had to be re-forged from scratch. Others were carefully straightened by hand. Every gear had to be measured, every tooth recut, every dial recalibrated. Menkel and his team faced a dilemma: should they rebuild the clock exactly as it had been or modernize it? In the end, they chose fidelity. The horloge would be restored as faithfully as possible to its medieval form, even if that meant using outdated techniques. The reasoning was simple. To modernize it would be to erase its history. In 1948, after 3 years of painstaking labor, the clock ticked again. When the horloge chimed for the first time since the war, the sound echoed through a city still bearing the scars of occupation. Crowds gathered and wept. It was not just a mechanical triumph. It was a civic resurrection. The horloge had become, once more, the heart of Prague. The communist years, in the decades that followed, Czechoslovakia lived under a different kind of timekeeping. The cold rhythm of state bureaucracy. Everything was scheduled, monitored, and measured. The horloge, by contrast, seemed almost subversive. It ticked at its own pace, indifferent to ideology. Tourists from the Eastern Bloc came to see it. Schoolchildren were brought on field trips. Foreign dignitaries were photographed before it. Maintenance continued quietly behind the scenes. The city employed a full-time caretaker, part mechanic, part historian, whose job was to win the clock by hand each day. He climbed the same narrow stairs his predecessors had climbed for 6 centuries, lit the same lamps, and listened to the same gears. His name was Luba Kotek, and he would become something of a legend himself. Kotek began caring for the horloge in the 1950s and continued until his death in 2011. For over half a century, he kept the clock alive through regimes, reforms, and revolutions. He called it Old Lady with Many Moods. He learned its language intimately. The pitch of its chime, the strain in its gears when the weather turned cold, the faint tick that warned of misalignment. To him, every repair was personal. In interviews, Kotek spoke of the clock as if it were a person. She grows tired. Sometimes she complains. You must listen to her breathing. It is difficult to imagine a more fitting caretaker for a machine that had long since transcended function. The Velvet Revolution and beyond, in 1989. As the communist regime collapsed and the Velvet Revolution filled the streets, the horloge watched silently. Students waved banners below its tower. Soldiers deserted their posts. The crowd chanted for freedom. The clock continued to tick. When democracy returned to Prague, the horloge once again became a symbol, not of religion, not of empire, but of endurance through time. It had survived kings, wars, fires, and ideologies. Now it would preside over a modern republic, and yet even in peace it demanded care. Each year, craftsmen inspected its mechanisms, replaced worn teeth, repainted the zodiac ring. The restoration of 2005 replaced damaged wood, while the major overhaul of 2018, undertaken for its 600th anniversary, brought it closer to its original medieval design than it had been in centuries. During that restoration, technicians found layers of previous repairs: 19th century ironwork, 20th century brass fittings, even wooden components dating back to the 1500s. It was a palimpsest of care, time layered upon time. When the clock restarted after the 2018 overhaul, its gears gleamed under soft electric light. Yet despite all the modern tools and sensors, its rhythm remained the same as it had been in 1401 patient tick per second. The meaning of time: what does the horloge mean now? In a world of digital watches and atomic clocks that can measure billionths of a second, it no longer tells accurate astronomical data. Its zodiac positions are centuries out of date, but accuracy is no longer the point. The horloge has become a meditation, a reminder that time is not merely measured, it is endured. Standing in the square at dusk, when the crowd quiets and the evening light turns gold on the clock's face, you can still hear it. The faint, deliberate ticking, steady as breath. It sounds almost human. For 600 years, this machine has marked every hour in a city that has known occupation, liberation, prosperity, and poverty. It has watched the invention of printing, of electricity, of the internet, and through all of it, it has done one simple thing: continued. In an age obsessed with speed, the horloge invites slowness. In an age of algorithms, it rewards patience. In an age of short attention, it simply endures. Perhaps that is why people still gather to watch it. Not because it is spectacular, it isn't, but because it represents continuity. Every hour, when death rings his bell and the apostles pass by, the crowd's attention narrows to that small motion of carved wood and brass. The clock's tiny performance reminds them, if only for a moment, that history is made not of great events, but of persistence. The horloge is not a monument to time, it is a conversation with it, And in that conversation lies something more profound than precision, a kind of faith that outlasts belief. Faith in maintenance, faith in care, faith that even in a world rebuilt and burned again, something as simple as a gear turning in a tower can connect centuries. When you stand there, beneath its face, and feel the slow rhythm of its ticking, it no longer feels medieval, it feels human. And perhaps that is what the clockmakers of Prague always intended, that long after the empires and doctrines and wars had faded, their work would remain as proof that patience itself can be immortal. If you wish to understand ancient Egypt, forget the pyramids. Forget the gold, the mummies, and the gods with falcon heads. Begin instead with a ledger, a rectangular tablet of limestone, its surface covered with rows of small, neat symbols. It records in columns the most important measure in Egyptian life: grain. To the Egyptians, grain was not merely food, it was time, money, and survival. It was the medium through which the entire civilization moved, from the peasants who harvested it to the priests who offered it, to the officials who counted, taxed, and stored it. Every loaf of bread, every jar of beer, every wage and offering was written in grain. And at the heart of that immense, unhurried system stood the bureaucrats of the Nile, scribes, counters, and overseers whose task was not to build monuments, but to keep track of them. Their world was not glamorous. It was dusty, exacting, repetitive. But it was their patience, not the pharaoh's ambition, that kept the kingdom alive. The river's clock, the Nile, was Egypt's clock. Each year, between June and September, its waters swelled and spilled over the fields, leaving behind a layer of black silt, fertile, life-giving, and entirely beyond human control. For centuries, the Egyptians treated this rhythm as divine. They did not try to conquer the flood. They measured it, marked it, and built their bureaucracy around it. The year began when the waters rose. The priests of Heliopolis would observe the first appearance of the star Sirius, the signal of the inundation, and announce the new year. From that day forward, every task was scheduled: plowing, sowing, harvesting, taxation. The pharaoh was said to control the flood, but everyone knew it was the scribes who controlled the records. At the great granaries of Memphis, Thebes, and Abydos, they stood with styluses and tablets, noting every delivery. They recorded how many sacks of barley came in from each field, how much was set aside for temple offerings, how much for soldiers, how much for the workers who built the tombs and temples. Each transaction, however small, was copied in triplicate: one copy for the temple, one for the overseer, and one for the royal archive. The Egyptians had invented bureaucracy before they invented coinage. The world of the scribe. The scribe was the quiet hero of Egyptian civilization. He rarely appears in art except seated cross-legged, writing on a scroll, his face calm and detached. In truth, his life was disciplined and monotonous. A boy destined for scribal service began training young, perhaps at age 6 or 7. He learned the shapes of hieroglyphs first, then the faster, more practical hieratic script used for daily documents. His teachers drilled him in copying phrases like, "A scribe is greater than a man with a hoe. Writing is better than work in the field." And it was true. While laborers bent under the sun, the scribe sat in the shade, his reed pen in hand, his palette of red and black pigments by his side. Yet the work was far from effortless. He had to memorize complex tables of measures. How many heket of barley filled a sack? How many sacks filled a storehouse? A single error could mean an entire village being over or undertaxed. Most of his writing was not sacred but practical. Receipts, rations, tallies, lists of workers, and their daily portions of bread and beer. From the workers at the pyramid of Khufu to the artisans in the Valley of the Kings, everyone in Egypt lived by such rations. A typical daily allowance for a laborer might read, "To the worker not, 3 loaves, 2 jugs of beer." That line, copied 1,000 times, was the heartbeat of the kingdom, the storage of survival. Because the Nile's flood came only once per year, the Egyptians had to master storage. They built vast granaries, domed mud brick structures designed to keep out rats and moisture. Each granary had a narrow slit at the top for pouring in grain and a small door at the bottom for releasing it. Inside, the air was cool and dry, filled with the faint smell of dust and life. The scribes worked nearby, sitting at low wooden tables, marking clay seals for every delivery. The seal bore the symbol of the storehouse, the year of the flood, and the name of the responsible official. If grain went missing, the seal was broken and the culprit found. The precision was astonishing. Some surviving records, carved into limestone tablets, tracked the grain intake of a single month in minute detail. 220 heckat of barley from the eastern field, 300 from the western. The entire economy of Egypt, Temples, armies, artisans, even the pharaoh's household ran on these numbers. And yet, the scribes themselves were rarely wealthy. They were respected, yes, but also replaceable. Their skill was literacy, and literacy was the property of the state. The boring miracle, the genius of Egypt was not its monuments, but its monotony. For more than 2,000 years, the system of taxation, storage, and rationing remained virtually unchanged. Dynasties fell, invasions came and went, but the ledgers of grain continued. The scribes kept writing, the storehouses kept filling, the people kept eating. It was in effect a civilization built on paperwork. To modern eyes, it seems dull, yet that dullness was the secret of its longevity. Egypt's greatness lay not in invention but in continuity. Even when the Old Kingdom collapsed around 2200 BCE and the central government faltered, the grain bureaucracy persisted. Local officials continued to measure, store, and distribute rations as they always had. The rhythm of bread outlasted the rhythm of kings. When order returned under the Middle Kingdom, the bureaucracy simply reattached itself to new rulers, its ledgers intact. It was as though the scribes, not the pharaohs, were the true rulers of Egypt, and their rule was one of ink and patience. A day in the ledger, imagine. Then, a single day around 1800 BCE in the city of Thebes. The sun rises, casting a yellow light over the mud brick buildings. The Nile glitters beyond the palm groves. In the courtyard of the temple granary, workers form a line, each carrying baskets of barley. The air smells of chaff and sweat. At a low table sits the scribe Hori, his reed pen ready, a damp cloth beside him to erase mistakes. He dips the pen in black ink and begins his work. Received from the field of Kenti 4 sacks of barley. Received from the field of Merisank 2 sacks, half measure deducted for transport. Delivered to the baker's house 3 sacks. Remaining in store 78 sacks. The entries are simple, repetitive, almost meditative. The numbers march down the tablet like quiet soldiers. At noon, Hori pauses to eat his ration, a loaf of coarse bread and a jug of beer, and then returns to work. By sunset, his fingers are stained with ink, his mind humming with figures. He seals the record with the temple stamp and hands it to a messenger. Tomorrow, he will do the same, and the next day, and the next year, for as long as the river flows. The philosophy of order to the Egyptians, this endless repetition was not tedious, it was sacred. They believed that the order of the world depended on human beings performing their duties correctly. If the grain was measured fairly, the flood would come as expected. The sun would rise, the gods would be satisfied. Every accurate ledger was, in its way, a prayer. The scribe's calm precision maintained the balance between chaos and order. The smallest miscalculation could tip that balance. Thus, bureaucracy was not merely practical, it was moral. When a scribe drew a line of numbers, he was, in his quiet way, upholding the cosmos. Bread as memory, the physical act of eating, was also bureaucratic. Bread was baked in standardized forms, beer brewed in measured batches, distributed according to lists. Every worker's ration was written down, every loaf accounted for. At the workmen's village of Deir el Medina, the community that built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, archaeologists have found thousands of ostraca, scrap potsherds inscribed with ration records. They read like the hum of daily life. Delivered today 1 loaf to Panifa, absent on account of illness. 2 loaves withheld from High, absent without leave. Each line, dull on its own, together paints a portrait of survival, of a society that functioned because someone kept count. It is a strangely modern story, the power of paperwork to hold a civilization together, the fragile abundance, and yet, for all its precision, Egypt's system depended on a single, unpredictable fact: the flood. When the Nile failed, when the waters rose too low or too high, the entire bureaucratic edifice trembled. Scribes could record the deficit, overseers could count the missing grain, but no one could make the river rise. Famine followed, and with it rebellion. The Admonitions of Ipua, a text from the Middle Kingdom, describes one such crisis. Behold, the river is blood, and men shrink from tasting it. Grain is lacking on every side, the storehouses are broken open, every man seizes what he finds. For a moment, the great order collapsed, the ledgers overturned, the seals broken, mart undone. But the flood returned. The scribes resumed their work, and Egypt began counting again. Theirs was a faith not in eternity, but in recurrence. That even after chaos, the rhythm would return, the grain would flow, the bread would rise. And perhaps that is the quietest miracle of all, that an entire civilization could be built not on conquest or innovation, but on the calm repetition of men like Hori, who wrote the same words every day for 50 years by the light of a single oil lamp. To understand how the Egyptian state endured for nearly 3 millennia, you must imagine a world in which taxation was prayer and accounting was a form of devotion. The temple, not the palace, was the true center of power. It was a storehouse, a workplace, a treasury, a granary, and a tax office, all beneath the watchful eyes of gods who, in their own strange way, depended on bread. The divine storehouse, every major temple in Egypt functioned as both a spiritual and economic institution. The temples of Amun at Thebes, of Pitar at Memphis, of Ra at Heliopolis, each possessed vast estates of farmland, herds and workshops. The produce from these lands was the lifeblood of the temple: grain for offerings, linen for ritual clothing, cattle for sacrifice, beer for feasts. To the gods, offerings were food; to the priests, they were taxes. The people brought their grain, honey, or oil as temple tribute. Some was burned before the divine statue, but most was stored, redistributed, or traded. Temples lent grain to farmers during bad floods and collected repayment after harvest, often with interest. By the New Kingdom, the wealth of the temples rivaled that of the crown itself. The records from the reign of Ramesses III show that the Temple of Amun alone controlled more than 80,000 people: farmers, herders, brewers, weavers, and scribes, and owned over 400,000 cattle. The gods, it seemed, were landlords, and the men who managed their wealth, the scribes, priests, and overseers, ruled through patience and ink. The tax in kind in Egypt, taxation was not paid in coins. For most of Egyptian history, coins did not exist. Taxes were collected in kind: grain, flax, oil, cattle, or labor. Each farmer owed a portion of his harvest to the state. The amount was measured by the height of the Nile flood and assessed by inspectors who walked the fields with measuring cords. These inspectors, called harpanaptai, used rope and wooden stakes to mark the boundaries of each plot, calculating its area by eye. Their measurements determined everything: how much grain a farmer owed, how much a village was worth, how much bread would feed the temple workers. It was not a fair system, but it was consistent. After the harvest, the farmer would bring his sheaves to a threshing floor, where state officials waited with scribes. The grain was beaten, winnowed, and measured with standard baskets. The scribe recorded: field of Nact, 5 arara sound, yield of 60 het, tax 20. The remaining 40 were his, enough to feed his family, his laborers, and perhaps a small surplus for barter. He might grumble, but he did not resist. The system was ancient, sanctioned by religion and habit. To refuse tax was to reject Ma'at, the divine order of the world. The bread of the gods every morning. In every temple across Egypt, the same ceremony took place. Before dawn, priests entered the sanctuary to awaken the god. They washed the statue, clothed it in fresh linen, anointed it with oil, and placed food before it: bread, beer, meat, and fruit. The food was not truly consumed after the ritual. It was removed and eaten by the priests. But the offering was more than symbolic. It maintained the link between divine order and human labor. Each loaf placed before the god had a history. Someone sowed the field, someone cut the wheat, someone milled the flour, someone baked the bread, someone recorded the transaction. When the bread reached the altar, it represented the collective work of thousands, the entire bureaucratic system compressed into a ritual gesture. And when the priests ate it, they consumed the proof of that order. The hierarchy of loaves: Egyptians did not eat all bread equally. There were dozens of varieties distinguished by shape, grain, and purpose. Some were coarse, round loaves for laborers. Others were fine, white cones made for temple offerings. Still others were molded into animal shapes for festivals. The temple bakeries were massive industrial complexes, often with hundreds of ovens burning day and night. Clay molds filled with dough were stacked into domed kilns, the air heavy with heat and smoke. The scribes recorded each batch with precision: 120 loaves type C, baked for the Feast of Opet; 72 loaves type D, distributed to the Bakers' Guild. Bread, in its quiet variety, revealed the social order: fine bread for the divine, middling for the priests, coarse for the workers. Even the gods, it seemed, had a taste for hierarchy. The god of record among the Egyptian deities, one held special favor among bureaucrats: Thoth, god of writing, wisdom, and the moon. In temples, Thoth was depicted with the head of an ibis, holding a reed, pen, and palette. He was said to have invented hieroglyphs, recorded the judgments of souls in the afterlife, and measured time itself. Scribes prayed to him before beginning their work: O Thoth, who weighs the words of men, may my hand not err, may my ink not fade. In a society that worshipped order, Thoth was the divine accountant, a celestial mirror of every scribe on earth. Every tolly of grain, every list of workers, every temple inventory was a small act of imitation. a reflection of divine order into human practice. When a scribe wrote, he was not only recording history, he was participating in it. Bureaucracy as ritual, the Egyptians blurred the line between administration and religion so thoroughly that one could not exist without the other. To measure a field was to affirm the god's dominion. To record grain was to preserve mart. To deliver rations was to perform service to the divine household. Every act of bureaucracy was infused with sacred significance. In the instruction of Ptah-hotep, a collection of wisdom texts from the Old Kingdom, the ideal official is described not as powerful, but as calm, impartial, and precise. Do not be arrogant because of your knowledge. Speak with the ignorant as with the learned, for no man is born wise. In that stillness of mind, Egypt found its rhythm, a state sustained not by violence, but by ritualized order. The temple workshops beyond the granaries and bakeries. Each temple ran workshops that produced goods for the gods: linen weaving, metalworking, sculpture, and perfume making. These were not independent artisans, they were temple laborers, paid in rations and bound by schedules as regular as those of modern factories. Their output was tracked in ledgers: 3 bolts of linen woven by the house of Neith, 2 jars of oil pressed from the eastern groves. The entire economy revolved around the temple's cycle of festivals and offerings. In a sense, Egypt was a nation of clerks working for a divine employer. The price of order, of course, such stability came at a cost. The bureaucracy, for all its efficiency, could be merciless. Corruption crept into every level. Overseers who inflated measurements, scribes who accepted bribes, priests who diverted offerings for personal feasts. The Satire of the Trades, a Middle Kingdom text, warns students that the scribe's life is preferable precisely because others suffer. The builder is covered in dust. The barber shaves until his fingers are weary. The weaver is bent double over his loom. Only the scribe sits in the shade and commands all others. Yet even the scribe was bound by fear. A single discrepancy in his records could bring punishment. Officials were held personally responsible for shortages, and missing grain could mean beatings or dismissal. Thus, the calm precision of the ledgers was born from anxiety as much as devotion. A bureaucracy of eternity. The greatest irony of the Egyptian system is that, while it was obsessed with permanence, it also depended on constant renewal. The temples had to be maintained daily, the offerings replaced, the ledgers updated, the workers fed. There was no completion, only continuation. In this endless maintenance, the Egyptians found eternity. The afterlife itself was imagined as a continuation of this world's order, the fields of reeds, where the blessed dead would plough, harvest and record forever under the watchful eye of Osiris. Even in paradise, the scribes were busy. The quiet empire by the New Kingdom. Egypt's temple bureaucracy had become an empire of paper, or rather papyrus. Records multiplied, detailing every loaf, every cow, every bolt of cloth. When modern archaeologists opened the archives of temples like Medinet Habu or Karnak, they found walls covered with inscriptions listing donations, taxes, and inventories. Endless rows of numbers and names. They read less like histories and more like spreadsheets carved in stone. Yet this dull precision was the foundation of Egypt's endurance. Other empires rose and fell in centuries. Egypt persisted for millennia, because someone, every day, counted the grain, the loaf as symbol in the end. The most common image found in Egyptian art is not the pharaoh's crown, nor the hieroglyphic eye, but the loaf of bread. It appears in offerings, in hieroglyphs, in the hands of gods. It is the symbol of sustenance, taxation, ritual, and continuity, a simple piece of food, but also a unit of measure, a record, a prayer. When a scribe drew the hieroglyph for life, he drew a loaf. It is a fitting symbol for a civilization that turned nourishment into order, that saw in the most ordinary act, the feeding of a body, the reflection of a divine principle. The bread that sustained men also sustained the gods, and the pen that counted it sustained both. The ledgers of Egypt's temples tell a story not of conquest, but of maintenance, of keeping the world steady, one loaf at a time. But what happened when that balance began to shift? When the temples grew too rich, the bureaucracy too heavy, and the floods no longer obeyed? When Egypt's most stable system began to collapse under its own weight, who held the pen and who went hungry? There comes a point in every system of order when the ledgers begin to outweigh the grain they record. When the scribe's ink flows faster than the river it depends upon. When the logic of bureaucracy turns upon itself. In ancient Egypt, that point came slowly, like the receding of the Nile. For nearly 2,000 years, the rhythm of flood and harvest sustained the kingdom. But the river, like all things, could fail. and when it did, the entire weight of Egypt's administrative perfection collapsed under its own precision. The lean years the Nile was not a machine. Its floods varied unpredictably, sometimes generous, sometimes cruelly thin. When the inundation failed, famine followed. And famine in Egypt was not a local misfortune, it was a national event. Because every loaf, every measure of barley, was already promised, to temples, to workers, to soldiers. There was little flexibility when the fields yielded less. The scribes continued to count, the overseers to demand, the temples to collect. There are records preserved on papyrus that describe officials visiting empty granaries, recording nothing, with the same careful handwriting they once used for abundance. Inspected the granary of the southern district. The bins are bare, the seals remain unbroken. Even when there was nothing left to measure, they measured it. The Nile, indifferent, flowed on, but shallower, slower, lazier. The collapse of Ma'at in Egyptian belief. Famine was not merely environmental, it was moral, a sign that Ma'at, the balance of order, had been disturbed. If the scribes erred, if the priests were corrupt, if the pharaoh neglected justice, the gods withdrew their favor, and the river shrank. The Admonitions of Ipuwer, a haunting text from the Middle Kingdom, describes the horror of such a time. Lo, the river is empty. Lo, grain is lacking on every side. The poor man owns wealth, and he who once owned is now poor. Men eat their children, laughter is no more. It is not a description of apocalypse, but of inversion, a world turned upside down when order collapses. The bureaucrats, once so certain, now stood helpless. Their ledgers could not conjure bread. Their laws could not summon rain. The same tools that maintained civilization became records of its failure. The scribe in the dust, imagine one such scribe, let us call him Quimweset, working in the waning days of the New Kingdom, around 1100 BCE. He sits in the courtyard of a half-empty granary near Thebes. The air is dry and metallic, the Nile running low beyond the reeds. Before him lies a papyrus roll, its fibers rough and brittle. His reed pen scratches slowly, hesitating between strokes. He writes, Year 8 of the reign of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Rameses may he live forever, inspected the storehouses of the temple of Amun, found therein 14 sacks of barley, 9 of emmer, delivered none, for the fields yielded no more. He pauses, looking up at the silent bens. The scribes have always believed that to write is to preserve, that if something is recorded, it endures. But what happens when there is nothing left to record? Quimweset dips his pen again and adds, almost reluctantly, May the gods restore the flood. Then he seals the papyrus and places it with the others, a row of empty promises. The end of centralization. Over time, Egypt's bureaucracy became too vast, too slow, too rigid. As dynasties changed, power shifted from the pharaoh to the temples, then to local governors. The once unified system fractured into countless smaller administrations, each with its own scribes, its own ledgers, its own priorities. Temples hoarded grain. Officials falsified records. Farmers hid their harvests. The empire that had thrived on the illusion of perfect order now drowned in paperwork. Even in the Third Intermediate Period, Sigan 76-664 BCE, the scribes continued to produce detailed records. Lists of offerings to gods whose statues were no longer maintained. Accounts of festivals that no longer took place. The ink outlasted the rituals. The weight of records. Archaeologists at ancient sites like Medinet Habu and Amarna have uncovered piles of administrative fragments, tawly sticks, ostraca, shards of pottery scrawled with notes of deliveries, attendance lists, and tax receipts. Most of these documents record trivial details. 1 loaf delivered, 1 jug of beer issued, 1 worker absent. Together they form the most complete portrait of an ancient society ever known, not through its kings, but through its clerks. And yet, to read them is to feel the slow exhaustion of a civilization that could never stop writing, even as it starved. The priests of scarcity, when the famine struck, the temples, repositories of both food and faith, became fortresses. Priests closed their granaries, claiming to preserve the offerings for the gods. Farmers begged outside their gates. Soldiers guarded the stores. In theory, the offerings were meant to sustain both gods and men. In practice, the priests grew rich while the peasants withered. In time, even the temple's wealth could not save them. When the river failed repeatedly in the late New Kingdom, their reserves ran dry. The bread of the gods spoiled, and the rituals ceased. A papyrus from the period reads with quiet despair, There is no flour for the loaves of Ra. The altars are empty, the lamps unlit. In that silence, Egypt's great religious economy crumbled. The loss of faith in the system. What happens when a people who believe in eternal order begin to suspect that their order no longer works? For Egypt, this was the slowest kind of revolution, not one of swords but of silence. The peasants stopped trusting the scribes stopped trusting the priests, and the pharaoh, distant in his palace, lost the power to command belief. Even language began to shift. The old hieroglyphic script, precise, sacred, slow, gave way to the faster, looser demotic script. It was as if the society itself was tired of ceremony. The bureaucracy, once divine, became merely administrative. The shadow of foreigners as Egypt weakened, foreigners came, Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks. Each brought their own systems of control, their own taxes, their own scribes. Yet even they could not entirely replace the Egyptian habit of recording. Greek administrators under the Ptolemies adopted Egyptian methods, detailed grain tallies, temple audits, lists of laborers. Papyrus scrolls from that era read like distant echoes of Conwaset's careful handwriting. The Nile bureaucracy had outlived its gods. It was by now a kind of secular immortality, the persistence of method after meaning. The archaeology of order. In modern times, archaeologists have reconstructed much of Egyptian life from its paperwork. The Wilbur Papyrus, for example, discovered in the 19th century, is a land survey from around 1140 BCE. It details more than 1,000 fields along the Nile, listing owners, tenants, and taxes owed. The document is breathtaking in its thoroughness, a final testament to Egypt's obsession with measurement, created on the brink of collapse. Every field is accounted for, every boundary noted, every bushel of grain recorded. And yet, not long after it was written, the kingdom disintegrated. Order, it seems, cannot survive on paper alone. The scribe's afterlife in Egyptian tombs. Scribes were often buried with their writing tools, a pen case, ink palette, and small rolls of papyrus. Some even carried model scrolls filled with prayers or fake records, an assurance that their duties would continue beyond death for them. The afterlife was not leisure, but continuity. In one tomb at Saqqara, a carving shows a scribe seated calmly before a blank papyrus. The inscription reads, "He who writes endures." Perhaps that was the truest faith of the scribes, not in gods or kings, but in writing itself. Even if the river failed, even if the temples fell, as long as someone wrote the truth of it, Egypt would not vanish. The return of the river history is rarely kind, but the Nile, at least, is patient. After centuries of drought and invasion, the river's rhythm returned. The floods rose again, not as high as before, but steady enough to feed a new generation of farmers. By then, Egypt was no longer Egypt. It was a province of Persia, then of Greece, then of Rome. Yet the scribes continued to write. Greek papyri from the Roman era still list deliveries of grain from Thebes, still record rations of bread and beer for temple workers, still mark the height of the flood with calm precision. It is as if the bureaucracy itself had become immortal, an organism that outlived every empire, every god. The quiet legacy today, when modern nations measure GDP, track rainfall, or distribute food aid, they do so with tools first shaped beside the Nile. The spreadsheet, the census, the ration book, all descend from those first ledgers of grain. The Egyptians taught the world a lesson that remains quietly true, that civilization does not depend on invention or conquest, but on the dull, sustaining patience of record keeping. Their scribes were not heroes, not philosophers, not warriors. They were men and women who measured the world so it would not vanish into chaos. They wrote so that life could continue, and in that act, boring, methodical, eternal, they became the guardians of human endurance. Epilogue. The empty ledger. In a museum in Cairo today, behind a glass case, lies a small limestone tablet. Its surface is lined with neat hieroglyphs, recording grain deliveries from a village near Abydos. The last line trails off abruptly. Delivered, 2 sacks of barley withheld for. The sentence ends mid-word. Perhaps the scribe was interrupted. Perhaps the ink dried before he could finish. Perhaps the flood came, and the village was washed away. It does not matter. That unfinished line, frozen in stone, is the most human part of the record. A pause in the long, monotonous music of order. It reminds us that every system, no matter how perfect, depends on the uncertain hands of those who keep count. And somewhere, even now, in an archive or a computer or a temple of bureaucracy, another hand continues the same work, marking the measure of the harvest, the flow of life, the quiet persistence of bread. In the year 1673, the shogunate decreed that all villages must submit annual reports of births, deaths, and rice yields. It was not a dramatic order. It did not make the poets sigh or the generals march, yet it changed the rhythm of the archipelago more than any sword ever could. For the first time, Japan became a nation of clerks. The clerk and the brush. In a narrow house near the Sumida River, a man named Takayama Genzu wakes before dawn. He is not a samurai, nor a merchant, nor a monk. He is a kanjioku, a local scribe employed by the magistrate's office. His work is endless, unheroic, precise. The light is faint, filtered through the paper walls. He grinds his ink slowly against the inkstone, the smell of pine soot and glue rising like incense. The grinding is meditative, a small prayer to clarity. His brush is made of weasel hair, his paper of mulberry fiber. These are his weapons. The first document of the day is a report from a nearby village. Genzu unfolds the scroll, reads the characters aloud, and begins to copy them into the official register. Each stroke is deliberate, each name an obligation. Outside, a boatman shouts. Inside, Genzu's brush whispers. In the Tokugawa world, writing is not merely communication. It is control, the soft machinery of rule. The bureaucracy of rice was more than food. It was currency, tax, and calendar. The wealth of a domain was measured in koku, the amount of rice needed to feed one man for a year. Every grain was counted, every field surveyed. From the shogun's castle in Edo to the smallest hamlet in the mountains of Shinano, a web of records held the country together. And at the center of that web sat men like Genzu, neither noble nor poor, yet bound by ink to the stability of the state. He did not own land or wield power, but he could make a farmer's name vanish with a stroke or restore a widow's inheritance with a single line. He was, in the quietest sense, dangerous. The discipline of writing to become a scribe required more than literacy. It demanded composure, the ability to sit unmoving for hours, to copy the same character 1,000 times without error or fatigue. Genzu had been trained in the temple schools, where children learned by copying sutras. A crooked line, his teacher had said, is a crooked soul. By adulthood, his body had learned the posture of obedience, back straight, knees folded, hands steady, but his mind was restless. Each document he copied contained stories, a quarrel between fishermen, a tax complaint from a widow, a list of newborns in a flooded village. He knew these people only through their names, yet they lived vividly in his imagination. He wondered if they knew how carefully he wrote them, how much effort it took to make their existence official. Perhaps they never would. The salt registers in the summer of 1678, a minor famine struck the Kanto plain. The harvest was thin, the salt shipments delayed. Salt, essential for preserving fish and pickling vegetables, became a matter of life and death. The magistrate ordered an emergency register of all salt merchants and their stock. For 3 months, Genzu and his assistants compiled lists. Names, weights, locations, prices. The work was maddening. Salt was smuggled, hoarded, falsified. Records conflicted. At night, he dreamed of white crystals pouring endlessly through his fingers. The government's response was methodical. It fixed the price, punished hoarders, and distributed rations through temples. The famine eased. The records remained. Years later, when the salt tax was revised, officials still relied on Genzu's original lists. The date of his sleepless summer became part of national policy. It was a small immortality. The philosophy of order. Japan in the 17th century was obsessed with kata, form, pattern, correct method. Whether in swordsmanship, flower arranging, or bookkeeping, perfection lay in repetition. Writing too had its kata. The stroke order of each kanji was a moral sequence. To deviate was to disrespect the order of the world. Genzu followed these forms with reverence. Yet sometimes, as he paused between lines, he felt a strange unease. Was the order he served truly natural? He saw the farmers taxed beyond endurance, the merchants censured for ambition, the outcasts recorded only as non-persons, all written neatly in the same clear hand. Ink was impartial, and that was its cruelty. The day of inspection once a year, an inspector from Edo visited to audit the registers. The entire office prepared as if for battle. The ledgers were dusted, the ink renewed. The clerks rehearsed their bows. When the inspector arrived, a thin man with the expression of a blade, Genzu presented the scrolls. They were flawless. The inspector nodded once, signed his seal, and departed. That night, the office celebrated with sake. Genzu did not drink much. He sat apart, watching the ink on his fingers dissolve into the sake cup's reflection. For all their perfection, the ledgers were only as truthful as the men who wrote them. He wondered how many lies lay hidden in his own handwriting. The unwritten letter. There was one document Genzu never submitted, a letter he began and abandoned 100 times. It was addressed to his brother, a Ronin who had left home after refusing to swear fealty. The letter was half confession, half apology. You sought freedom, and I chose obedience. Yet both of us are trapped. You by your sword, I by my brush. I sometimes envy your silence. He never sent it. The letter remained folded in his ink case, absorbing the scent of soot and paper for decades. The Fire of Edo in 1682, the Great Fire of Mairiki swept through Edo, consuming thousands of houses, including the records office. Gens's ledgers, the work of a lifetime, burned to ash. He watched from across the river as the night sky glowed red, the city's archives turning into smoke that drifted east over the bay. For weeks afterward, the officials scrambled to reconstruct the lost data. They summoned every surviving scribe, including Genze, to recompile the records from memory. He wrote until his fingers cramped, until he could no longer distinguish what he truly remembered from what he merely invented. It didn't matter. The government accepted his work as fact. Thus began a new archive rebuilt upon fragments of human recall, a fiction that became official truth. The ethics of memory in later years. Genze sometimes visited temples that kept copies of his old ledgers. He would run his fingers over the faint strokes of ink, now faded brown with age. He realized that memory and record were not opposites but partners. Each failed without the other. The ink preserved the bones, memory filled in the flesh. When both were lost, the past became silence. The death of the brush in 1701 at the age of 63, Genze fell ill. His hand trembled, his vision blurred. He asked to be buried with his inkstone and brush. When his apprentices protested, saying such tools were for monks, not scribes, he smiled faintly. The Buddha had his sutras. I have my reports. He died quietly, surrounded by scrolls. His handwriting, meticulous and steady, would be copied by younger clerks for generations as an example of correct form. His name, however, was rarely recorded. His work was anonymous, but his style endured, the invisible backbone of order. The afterlife of bureaucracy 2 centuries later, when Japan modernized under the Meiji Restoration, new bureaucrats in Western suits still wrote their reports with brushes. Their handwriting was different, but the rhythm was the same: count, record, seal, submit. Even as typewriters arrived, the brush persisted in signatures and official seals. Ink had become not just a medium, but a form of devotion, to accuracy, to hierarchy, to the quiet beauty of procedure. The Museum of Ledgers today, in a small museum in Tokyo, one can see a collection of Edo period administrative documents, rice registers, tax scrolls, salt lists. Most are unsigned. None bear the names of the clerks who made them. Yet their handwriting is graceful, steady, unhurried, almost tender. Among them, one page bears a faint note in the margin. The hand grows wary, but the work must be finished. The curator does not know who wrote it. But somewhere, beneath layers of time and formality, one can almost sense Genze's tired smile, the patience of a man who believed that even the smallest act of order could hold back the chaos of the world.